Welcome to my podcast. Why am I in my bed? Because, for starters, I am sick, and that is something that we're dealing with. But also, this episode video is about happiness, and this is what makes me happy. So, we're gonna go with as comfortable as I can make it. So this episode is about philosophies of happiness, and we're going to specifically be looking at Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, the Prince of Abyssinia. Now, this is an 18th century novel, and if you haven't heard of it, no one can blame you because it's kind of been lost to time, I feel. Not one of the ones that really sticks around my name unless you're in the know. But it's a really good book, and it has a lot of really insightful ideas, as well as some kind of depressing things. So let's just get into it. A general overview of the novel is we start off with Rasselas, who lives in the Happy Valley, which is this place enclosed by mountains. You can't get in or out, but everything you could ever want will be supplied to you. So all your needs, desires, everybody's happy. Except for Rasselas. He feels like there's something missing in his life. And eventually he meets this guy named Imlock, who has been to the outside world, has seen it all, and offers to be Rasselas's guide. So Rasselas, his sister Nicaea, and her maidservant Pakua all leave with Imlock. They escape the Happy Valley, and they go on a journey to learn what's the best way to live. So they encounter a bunch of different people, figure out, is this person happy and how are they living? So maybe we can emulate that. And spoiler alert, though I don't know if it's really that much of a spoiler because this was released several hundred years ago. After all of their adventures and their communication with other people, the group comes up with a couple things for each of them that they would like to do in life. And then, right when they come to this conclusion, they decide, actually, it's not possible, and they decide to go back to the Happy Valley. So this ending has left a lot of questions for me and other readers, going back right to when Johnson published the book. So I just want to get a sense, too, of the general readership outside the scholarly analysis, because we will be looking at scholarly analysis. So I always like to take a look at the Goodreads reviews to see how people are interacting with the book. First, the 5-star reviews. We have one from Justin, who says, "It staggers me when I reflect on just how insightful Samuel Johnson was. I return to a collection of essays I have of his frequently and always with profit. And now I know I will return to this too." Rebecca says, "To be perfectly honest, I have no idea why I love this book. I just do." And then taking a look at the 1-star reviews, because I do think it's always helpful to get the other end of the spectrum. Morgan says, "My God, this was so boring. I had to read it for my 18th century lit course. And goodness, I hope I don't have to read anything so terrible anytime soon. It was just so philosophical, and nothing happened. Blah." Moonchild says, "If it weren't for my assignment, I wouldn't have imagined reading this ever." So it is definitely a divisive book. I will say that I do not personally find 18th century literature the most accessible. So anyone who says, like, oh, it's an easy read, I would take that with a grain of salt. But I do give it a little more credit than maybe our friend Morgan does. I feel like there were some things that happened. And so let's just kind of get into that. Now, there seems to be 2 strains of philosophical thinking that are really prominent in Rasselas, and that's what I want to cover today. So the first one is this Rousseauian idea of life according to nature. Now, I'll be honest, when I first read the book, I thought that this was what the author was arguing for. I've now come to realize that I confused nature as far as like the elements and the natural world with nature as in a natural state of being or the way, you are born. And that the latter is actually the Rousseauian philosophy that Johnson seems to be arguing against. So this philosophy is this idea that you should live according to the way that is innate, and any social institutions that you have come to get used to outside of that have actually taken you away from your nature and your happiness. And so I think a good quote to kind of encapsulate that is in chapter 22 of Rasselas. And it's when this philosopher is saying, the way to be happy is to live according to nature, in obedience to that universal and unalterable law with which every heart is originally impressed, which is not written on it by precept, but engraven by destiny, not instilled by education, but infused at our nativity. So essentially, it's just living the way that is innate and natural, and not the way that is imposed on you by social institutions. So the character in Rasselas that is saying these things has often been attributed to being a sort of caricature of Rousseau himself. And it is important to qualify. Gwyn J. Cole was a scholar who was researching this in the 1950s and 70s. Points out that, Rousseau's publication of his writings that talk about living according to nature were actually published after Rasselas was. So Johnson isn't responding directly to those writings, but this is a broader discussion that's happening in the 18th century around Johnson's time. So it makes complete sense that Johnson would be responding to this. He might just not have been envisioning that this philosopher that's saying these things is Rousseau himself. But nevertheless, it is emblematic of this Rousseauian philosophy. And we really get Johnson's rebuttal against it at the end of the chapter, when it says, the prince soon found that this was one of the sages whom he should understand less as he heard him longer. So basically, this guy's just full of hot air and doesn't really know what he's talking about, because he can't portray it even to his audience. So maybe we're not fans of the Rousseauian philosophy of living in accordance with nature. But then there is another philosophy that is present in the book, and that's Stoicism. And again, Gwyn Kolb talks about Stoicism in his writing. He really pins down the classical sources that Johnson would be drawing from. And essentially, Stoicism is this idea that happiness and the good life is found in rejecting, as much as possible, human pleasures and pains, just intense emotional experiences, and instead committing yourself to a life of philosophy and philosophical thinking. And so the prince encounters a man who does this, and he is an intense stoic. He really, prizes people who can relinquish their emotions. And then shortly after Rasselas meets him, the guy's daughter dies, and he is not able to consolidate his philosophy with his grief. And, Rasselas responds in maybe not the best way to approach a grieving person, but he says, mortality is an event by which a wise man can never be surprised. And the philosopher responds, young man, you speak like one that has never felt the pangs of separation. And again, maybe not so helpfully, but nevertheless a fair question. Rasselas says, have you then forgot the precepts which you so powerfully enforced? Has wisdom no strength to arm the heart against calamity? And so here we really see a questioning of that Stoic philosophy and the reality of its implementation. Like, yes, it might be good in theory to renounce all emotions and really commit yourself towards intellectual exercises, but is that really realistic? And there's also this moment where Imlach comes in right before the prince finds out about this kind of hypocritical aspect of the Stoic philosophy. And Imlach says, be wary, quote, they discourse like angels, but they live like men. And so, again, there's this aspect of, philosophers kind of talk as if they're outside of the human body, as if they can separate themselves from the human body, but in reality, they are still human. So then we have these two philosophies that are presented to us and then rejected. And it actually makes a lot of sense that Johnson wouldn't really be into this kind of all or nothing thinking. The scholar Marvin Fisher points out that Johnson was a conservative thinker. And in the 18th century, conservatism meant something slightly different than it does now. Marvin Fisher explicitly says that it was the preservation of traditional human values and the encouragement of moral principles which seem to have endured throughout human experience. So essentially this idea that, there are these things that keep popping up for this. There's these ways of living that seem to be true for humans in general, and those are the ways that we should be living. So this ideology is really hesitant to accept any, new and radical ways of living and thinking. It really seeks balance. And so Stoicism is kind of this extreme intellectual ideas, and living according to nature seems to be this extreme emotional reception. And so Johnson really doesn't believe in going one way or the other. He thinks there should be a balance in between. And so it makes sense that he would not subscribe to these two extreme philosophers. So if we can't do Stoicism, and we're not going to find happiness in living in accordance with nature, and there's all these other lifestyles that Rasselas looks at and decides this is not the way to happiness, is there even a way to happiness? And a lot of people who have gotten to the end of the novel say, according to Johnson, no. But there are people who do find happiness even at the last chapter. So one of them is Samuel Jekyll, and he really seeks to reconcile the novel's kind of pessimism with Johnson's other writings that refer to this idea of Christian hope. And how can someone who subscribes to this idea of Christian hope write something so gloomy? And so he really points out that, maybe Johnson doesn't believe that happiness is attainable in our present life on Earth, but that there is this, immortal life or afterlife where we as souls experience happiness. And then Chance David Paul, another scholar of the text, actually finds this strain in Rasselas through this idea of Thomistic teleology, and this idea of Thomistic teleology is a big word for Elmo.
That's a big word for Elmo.
So I did look it up. The Thomistic part refers to Thomas Aquinas, who is another one of these, philosophical, intellectual thinkers. And teleology refers to this philosophical method that believes that there is an end goal to something, that there is an end. Telos meaning end in Greek. And so Paul points out this quote from Nicaea where she says that she's going to find her choice in eternity. And uses that to say, again, maybe happiness isn't attainable on earth, but it is in the afterlife. Both Paul and Jekyll point out that Johnson was really against laziness and idleness in his writings, and so he would never believe that, just because there is no happiness in this life, only in the afterlife, that means that we shouldn't do things in our life. He really believed that you needed to constantly be having a purpose and working. And so the group, decides that they have all of these things that they want to do, and they're going to bide their time and busy themselves with other things, and then find happiness in the future. Now, I would push back on this reading of Paul's, I would say, because each of them finds something really substantial that they would like to do, and then they reject this to go back to the Happy Valley. Now, they could be also following pursuits in the Happy Valley. There are tons of things that they could be doing, but it seems that they have these very concrete ideas of ways to, commit their life to something, and then they don't do that. So I would like to see how, that works out a little bit more, but I don't know. And finally, this other scholar, Rachel Michelle Stern, says that, maybe Rasselas and his group didn't find happiness because they were conceptualizing happiness wrong. And even though they didn't find it, we can learn from their mistakes and find it. And she says that the problem with Rasselas's and his companions' idea of happiness is that it views it as a sort of reward or an end goal. So this is that teleological idea. And Stern is really arguing against that. She says that that's the fatal flaw, that they're not conceptualizing happiness in the way that they should be. At the beginning, Rasselas says he's looking for something to desire, something to pursue, and then he's also somehow looking for happiness that once you attain it, you can no longer pursue it. And so there's this implied tension between those two things that prevents Rasselas from really finding the thing that he's looking for. But instead, we should conceptualize happiness as this ongoing task. It's a commitment to an idea. And it's a way of living, not just something that you find after, a long enough journey. So maybe there is happiness in the text, just not for Rasselas and his companions, but we can hopefully learn from his journey. I do think that Rasselas ends very open-ended, and that we can't really know for sure what Johnson was intending for us to think, and I do think that's purposeful. But I did enjoy that, dig through scholarly interpretations. I think what's evidence of this enduring question of how to be happy is the fact that it is enduring, that we still don't have an answer. So Johnson didn't have an answer, and even though these scholars, have their own interpretations, they aren't fully satisfying. So now let's take a look at a modern idea of happiness, and this is coming from Alain Badiou's book on happiness. Badiou describes himself as an anti-philosopher, which is essentially this idea that philosophy has in the past sought one concrete truth, one way of living that is above all, the best way of living. And Badiou says that this does not recognize the reality that there are a multiplicity of truths, and that experiences can't be boiled down to one, platonic form of the best way to live. And Badiou points out some other critiques or inconsistencies in the concept of philosophy. On page 68 of my edition, he says, the philosopher is outside, he is not a participant, which may sound familiar to Imlach's warnings about the Stoic philosopher, that he may pretend to be someone who is on the outside, who looks at society and comes up with their idea of how it is, but this is a pretense that believes that the philosopher is not actually inside society, which is not true. So Badiou comes from this idea of anti-philosophy, and he tells us how he thinks we can come to happiness. And for Badiou, happiness is not something that is quite attainable for us yet. He sees 4 principal obstacles, and I'm just going to read these off as he describes them. He calls them the reign of commodity, the reign of communication, monetary universality, and technical and productive specialization. So the reign of commodity essentially refers to this idea that we are driven by our material needs, and that is the main focus of our life. And this really connects to his idea of monetary universality, which is essentially saying that money is this universal thing that connects us, and it's not something that's shared between us, but it is a standard among every culture. And then the reign of communication is this idea that we are not fully communicating with each other, that my language, even though we could both be speaking English, it means something different for me as I'm talking than it does for you. And so we're never truly on the same page about things. And then technical or productive specialization, this idea that we are trained in really one thing, and that we need to protect our security in that. And so he views these as the four things that are standing in our way as a society of happiness. And he really believes that, societal happiness is the key to happiness. We can't have individual happiness that is actually real. It is a universal good. And so for Badiou, happiness comes when we change the world, and we can change the world through a series of events. And he has a very specific definition of an event. It has to be something that is unexpected and that creates lasting change. And so he's a French philosopher. He refers to this example in 1968 in France when a group of students and a group of factory workers banded together in protest. And this was really unexpected because, students come from this like young, intellectual, usually, middle class, upper class area, and factory workers are kind of the opposite of that. They are this lower class in society, usually, older than college age. And so seeing a bond between these two groups, a solidarity between these two groups, was really impactful for Badiou, and he said that created lasting change. And so you can't really plan an event, and you don't really know an event is an event until it happens. But with building up these, they will break down those obstacles, and that's where Badiou sees happiness as possible. And so this is kind of in line with some of those interpretations of Rasselas. Maybe Badiou is not going for like the Christian hope afterlife, but it does seem to be something that is not available to us right now unless we take specific steps to, work against these obstacles. And what's important for Badiou is that it's not something that, okay, I as one person can't do that. There is movement towards this better world in a lot of things, and those are specifically art, science, politics, and love. And he says that these interest all of humanity. So there's a lot of ways that we can create happiness, or like a bubble of happiness, in our present world, but it is something that relies on connection with other people. And I do think that that sense of universalism and really big emphasis on human connection isn't as prominent in Johnson's Rasselas. Not to say that that wasn't something that he was thinking about, but Badiou really emphasizes that happiness is found in these shared experiences. And I feel like, the motive for happiness in Rasselas is very individual. So that is one difference between this modern philosopher and the older source. So yeah, I hope this video gave some insight into happiness as we see it, as we can find it, and those discussions that have been really going on for a long time, especially all the way down to Johnson. This is a really rich book with a lot of ideas, and it's kind of a shame that it's not more widely known, because it was really big in its time to know. And I will say that 18th century is not the most accessible for casual reading, but there's lots of resources out there, and it's definitely worth a look, especially in comparison with Badiou. I highly recommend. So that's what we have.